Hi, hello, what's up, everyone? Hi to all you beautiful people. I hope we're all doing good today, shining bright like the sun, welcome to another one of my videos. We are doing a photography tutorial again today, and I just decided actually I'm just gonna be out here getting sun-kissed while I do my thing, so yeah, we are doing camera basics for today. So yeah, if you happen to own one of these babies, right, and you wanna understand how to use them manually, this will be the video that will show you how to do that. So I'll break it down into two parts, right? And this first part I will be focusing on how to properly expose to get the right images all the time. Okay, so how to use your camera manually, whether it's like any kind of camera, whether it's this kind of camera or any kind of camera. I'll just be showing you how to use it when you have it on manual, so you get the best results and quality out of any equipment that you use, right? So yeah, let's do this thing. Let me show you how it all rolls, how we do this thing. So first things first, family, right? This machine, this thing here, right? The DSLR has components that are quite similar to the human camera, which is the eye, right? So your eyes and the camera are one and the same thing, and they operate the same way. The only difference is that your camera doesn't have an intelligence to run it, to tell it how to see, so you are the intelligence, the actual eye that jumps into this machine to be able to help it to work and see the way that you would see things, right? And you do that by determining these three things, right? Which is your shutter speed, your aperture, which is your lens opening, and the sensitivity of your film, your ISO. Okay, these are the three things that determine your exposure, and that is in turn what makes the image. Because remember that photography is painting with light, so you are trapping light into this camera so it can produce the image that you want it to produce. Okay, so it also has the same design in nature. You know how like you are light being that has these cells that act like prisms that trap in your light to form the image of you? It operates the same way, so it's the same design. The camera is like a prism, like a cell that traps in the light to make the painting. So it's the same fundamentals, it's the same design. Your camera is an extension of you, so how you operate is how this baby operates, right? So yeah, with that being said, let me explain these three things individually, right, so that you understand how to make them work together to produce good quality images. Okay, so you are trying to create an image, right? You are making an image. The first thing you do, you look at the scene that you are trying to photograph, and you look at the light. So is it too bright or is it too dark? And you adjust your camera accordingly. Okay, so you determine the exposure by determining the three variables according to the light that's falling on the scene. So if there's too much light on the scene, maybe you want to close down the aperture to make it a bit small so there's not too much light going in. You want to have a faster shutter speed so that the timing of how much light is coming into your camera is quite limited. So all these things are determined on how the scene looks and what you are trying to achieve with the photograph. Okay, and how do you know when you are exposing correctly, right? When you look inside your viewfinder, your camera has an exposure meter, right? And this meter has a zero in the middle of it. You see the needle that's in the middle of your exposure. The needle, right, needs to sit in the middle. That's when you have the correct exposure. But if it's moving to the far right, then your picture is overly exposed. You are letting in too much light into your camera. Or when it's moving to the far left, which would be a negative, right? That means your image is getting quite darker. Okay, so you don't typically what you want to achieve is the correct exposure, because that is the needle in the middle where it sits on 0, right? So when you look into the camera, every time you adjust your aperture, your shutter speed settings, they should get to a point where the needle is sitting right in the middle, and that tells you that, okay, you've properly exposed for the picture. Now the camera is seeing the scene the same way that your eyes would interpret the scene, with the correct exposure, with the correct lighting. Okay, the image is not too blown out. Like, say for instance, when you move out of the house, right, from a dark space into a light space, your eyes automatically adjust themselves, right? But you will see that once you try to do the same thing with your camera, when you're moving from a dark space to a lighter space, the sky might be blown out, because now you are letting in too much light into the camera. Now everything's just getting too blown out, too bright, right? Now you need to adjust the settings so that the camera sees the same way that your eyes see, but your eyes do it quicker than the camera. Okay, your eyes is like a split second, your brain does it in a split second. That's why you don't walk outside and you're like, oh, the sky's blown out, you know. So that is your eye. Your eyes do the same thing that you do to your camera. It's always constantly adjusting according to the light that is on the scene. So you look at the scene, and that determines how you properly expose. So let me break down what I mean by ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, right? Let's start with the ISO. The ISO is a measure of the film speed and its sensitivity to light. So the sensor is what records the image. It's where the image sticks, right, on the sensor. So a low ISO requires longer exposures, right, and is referred to as slow. And a higher ISO requires less exposure and is referred to as fast. So there's two things that adjust how much light is received by the sensor, right? And that is your aperture and your shutter speed. So your shutter speed is how much time you are letting in light into your camera. So it's the length, right? And the shutter speed is like blinds, right, that open and close to let light into the camera, so it's recorded on the sensor. All right, so that shutter ring, right, has speeds that move from like 1 second to 2 seconds to a quarter of a second to a 60th of a second to so on and so forth, right? So generally the shutter speed determines it also determines whether the subject will freeze in motion or whether it will look like it's moving, right? So high shutter speeds freeze moments in time and make them appear sharp. So if a subject is running, you want to have a high shutter speed so you can freeze the moment. And when you want to add a feeling of motion to your images, you use a shutter speed that's quite long. So maybe you'll use like 2 seconds instead of using a 60th of a second. So the slower the time, the more light comes into the camera, right? And the more blur that you get, so you get more motion into the pictures. And the faster the shutter speed, the more you freeze moments. So yes, the shutter speed is the amount of time, it's the length in which the light is allowed to be trapped in your camera. So then we have the aperture, right, which is the opening that's on the lens and controls how much light is let into the camera to be recorded by the sensor. Okay, so the aperture is located on the lens, and the aperture works like your pupil on your eye, right? And it enlarges and contracts to admit more or less light. Okay, so it opens and closes like a ring so it closes like that, and then it opens to let in more light, right? And so the smaller the aperture, the greater the number. So if the aperture number is 22, that means that's a small opening. And if the aperture number is something like 2 or 4 or 5.6, that's a big opening. It's a smaller number, but it's a big opening on the lens. So it works quite opposite. The bigger numbers are small in opening, and the smaller numbers are how big the aperture has opened. The full stops operate like they operate on the shutter speed. So let's say a lens that is set at 4, like an aperture that's set at 4, emits half as much light as 2.8, but is twice as much light as an aperture that would be like 5.6, right? Notice that f-stops have the same half or double relationships that full stops have on the shutter speed settings as well. So they operate the same, right? So the greater the number, the half the amount of light, and the smaller the number, the twice the amount of light that you are letting into your camera. The smaller the aperture number, the greater the depth of field, and the bigger the aperture number, the less depth of field you'll have. Like for instance, if you have an image like this, right, that is an image that has what we refer to as a minimal depth of field, right, where one area is in focus and the rest is blurred. This is achieved when you use something like an aperture size that is like 2.8, like all the small numbers, 2.8, 1.4 or 2, right? That will help you achieve this image that has a shallow depth of field. And when you want to get an image like this that has a maximum depth of field, right, where everything is in focus, then you would use a smaller aperture, which is something from like 16 and above, 16, 22, right? Those are the apertures that can give you maximum depth of field. And the other thing that determines your depth of field is the distance that you have to your subject, right? So you need to be closer to your subject if you want to have a shallow depth of field. You need to get quite closer to the subject because your distance also determines how much of the area will be blurred and how much will be in focus, right? So look at it like this. Look at your eyes. Like for instance, right now, if I take my fingers and I put them here, right, and I look at my fingers will be sharp, but everything else around it will be blurred because it's closer to my eyes, right? So I have now a shallow depth of field, right, because my eye is using a very big aperture, which means it's opening up, right? So then that's how I get shallow depth of field. But when I move my fingers further on and I try to focus on the fingers right now from that distance, I see that the rest of the area seems to also be sharp, right? That's because I've moved further back. So this goes to show you that the closer the subject is the greater the depth of field, right? That's what I mean when I say the distance also affects the depth of field that you will have on the image. And I'm using the example with the eyes just to show you how much the camera and the eye work similar, right? So yeah, you use your eyes, that in turn shows you how your camera works. So fam, it's very important that you use true photography mathematics when you are working with your camera on manual. Like for instance, use true aperture f-stop numbers. Like use numbers that are relatable to photography. Like for instance, you move from an aperture of 5.6 to 4 to down to like 2.8 to like, you know, you don't just jump in between, because most of these digital cameras have that setting where you just jump in between, and that's like there's a certain science and mathematics behind photography, right? And you need to be able to learn to apply it to get your money's worth out of your equipment. Okay, so jeez, the rain is coming. So let me just wrap up this video real quick. So yeah, fam, learn the mathematics and the science, because it's a mathematics and science. Photography is a mathematics and science, especially when you use your camera manually and it's not thinking for you. Then you get to see these people are actually at work when they pick up this thing. It's not just child's play, right? So yeah, let me wrap up this video. Thank you so much for watching my stuff, family. Your support is always appreciated. I've done my end of the bargain with the video. You do yours by clicking the like button, sharing the video, and subscribing to the channel if you haven't. And for me, I'm about to be out of here because like you can see from those clouds that this rain is coming, and I can see it over there. You can't see it, but like the clouds are getting quite hectic there. So I'm just gonna jump back into the house now. Sunkissed is over. Yeah, the video is over, so I'm gonna meditate and be in my own zen. See you. Peace. Love you, fam. Mwah.